Then we have 4 wonderful speakers today. We have Peter Felton. He's the head of division for Humanitarian Assistance in the Federal Foreign Office in Germany. For those of you who are not aware of the system in Germany, the panel here is about humanitarian aid and development, which is in Germany divided over 2 ministries. So humanitarian aid is under the foreign ministry, and development is a separate ministry. So I'm sure we will hear some of the dynamics that brings to the table. As you notice, we have changed a little bit the order of the speakers from how it was announced in the program. So we start with Peter, then we will move on to Carla Mardini, who is the head of division for resource mobilization, ICRC. We will continue with Nabaz Al-Mirani. He's the president of DAMA organization and will tell us about what is happening here and now as we speak in Mosul. And then we will end the presentations with Guenter Froeschl. He is a member of the board of MDM, one of the organizers here in Germany. Now, may I invite you to sit? And may I invite all of you to make this a lively panel in several ways. One way is by Twittering and Facebooking, but you know that, the drill, it's up there. And the other one is by, we will try to get a real discussion out of the panel. So after we have the speakers, we will ask somebody, we will take the first person to react from the floor. And then the other folks who want to ask a question, we will first see if there are questions directly relating to the first question. So we try to get it a little bit around the topic, finish, and then a new topic. I don't know, we're experimenting. We will find out how it works. Now, if you allow me, I will start to outline a bit of the panel that we have, because when you see the title, Humanitarian Aid and Development, many of you realize that that's a very old topic. And since the 1990s, we talked a lot about linking relief, rehabilitation, development. It was then called LRRD. Now, apart from that, it died out a little bit. It fizzled out after the turn of the century. What is very typical about the LRRD thinking of its time was that it was usually presented as sequential. So first you have the relief, and then you have the rehabilitation, etc., towards the development. And secondly, it assumed that these were different actors. So it was like an estafette. You hand over. So you do the humanitarian, and then you hand over to development. Now that is those days. And then in the 2000s, we started to hear a lot about resilience, to the extent that some people considered perhaps resilience has taken over the agenda of LRRD. And resilience, of course, started more in the context of social natural disasters than in the context of conflict, where you would build resilience. The typical idea of resilience, it builds on the communities, it sort of unlocks the potential that is already present in the community to work towards resilience. That also means that approaches were integrated, building from the local level. You have integrated approaches, so you don't talk so much about relief development as sequential, but really integrated. Relief when necessary, development when possible. And there is usually a component of the responsibilization of authorities, because we all know that the causes of social natural disasters are not found only in the local community, but they stretch way beyond there. Also, the solutions are not just found in the communities, so communities were also encouraged to take up advocacy, to engage their authorities, to work with them in resilience. Now, what we see in recent years is that even in refugee care, the word resilience has come up very strongly. Now, what does it mean? It means that building on the resilience of people, it means that being a refugee alone doesn't give you an entitlement to assistance. This came up in the Syria crisis, in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, mainly there, where 90% of refugees are not in camps. and where increasingly the biggest story that aid is telling itself about itself is around the resilience of refugees. We have to help them help themselves, build on their own capacities. They can still be economic agents, they can work. And so that means that the only people who really get aid, it's not because you're a refugee, but it's because you're especially vulnerable. In reality, there is a concern that is now getting a bit more vocal, that these special vulnerabilities usually translate automatically in women and children, as being one word, women and children, and that we might have a concern, especially nowadays, about young men who are single men especially, who may fall out of the safety nets of aid altogether. Now, apart from this, we may ask some questions about this turn to resilience when it comes to refugees, whether it boils down perhaps to a politics of abandonment, when we rely on people to work for their own income, yet don't give the parameters, the legal space to do it and to allow them and entitle them to work. So there's a lot to say about this. Then, to go back to the relation between humanitarianism and development, I think that has now been replaced on the agenda very strongly because of the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain that came out of it. And the Grand Bargain is really one of its points is we need more collaboration between humanitarian and development actors. And that doesn't only mean that humanitarians have to work more with development. What it also means at the moment is development is moving increasingly to areas where we find lots of humanitarian action. The last report, the Global Humanitarian Assistance report, reminds us again that at this moment 80% of the poorest people in the world, who are actually the target of development, and the whole Sustainable Development Goals are meant to relieve people out of poverty, but then 80% of the poor people live in areas that are either in conflict or extremely vulnerable to environmental crisis. So, to a large extent, the areas where humanitarians work have come to overlap with the areas that are the primary target for development. So, development and humanitarianism is increasingly overlapping in terms of the people they focus on. And we see lots of changes happening in the system as we speak. Perhaps there are not so much changes in what aid is doing, but there are really changes in how aid is talking about itself. And that usually is also a token that there will also be real change on the ground. So one is that we don't speak often anymore of the humanitarian system, but the humanitarian ecosystem, which means that there's a lot of recognition at the moment that it's not just humanitarians who make the day in humanitarian crisis. There are so many different actors, local authorities, there are the national authorities, local authorities, service providers, diaspora contributions that far outweigh humanitarian flows, and even normal business of development, loans, World Bank kind of stuff is all happening in the humanitarian crisis areas. There's also a lot of talk now about localization. Again, a much stronger recognition of the fact that these other actors are there and that local authorities, local service providers should really be able to take their role in responding to crisis. And we see, and we can't almost talk enough about it, enormous technological changes that make system change also possible. It's really different if, as a humanitarian, you have to have close proximity to the people you serve, which may be in a camp, from when you can transfer money to a Visa card that people can use anywhere they are. Those kind of technological changes really make a difference on how aid can be organized and how aid and humanitarian aid and development crawls into each other. Now, finally, my last point that I hope may help this debate is that we often talk about humanitarian aid as a one thing. So we have this big debate like, oh yeah, the humanitarian principles are so important. And then somebody else will say, no, it's development and we have to do it more in another way. And very often that is because people have different scenarios in their minds. So the parameters of aid and of development and of national and local actors are really different when we talk in a situation of high intensity conflict, Syria, Yemen, or when we talk about a situation of refugee care, where maybe the principles are not the most important, but the Refugee Convention, and where the host government is the most important actor in deciding who is included and excluded from aid. Again, then we have the socio-natural disasters, which pose very different parameters, where some people say it's not even a humanitarian issue anymore, it's almost completely integrated in development with the DRR. Then we have the fragile settings where you have this increasingly complicated mix of, on the one hand, catering to humanitarian needs and at the same time trying to build institutions and trying to have a more institutional, stronger capacity to respond to future crises. Okay, so what I'm hoping is that in our debate, we can sometimes make that distinction. So maybe sometimes you can also refer to what you're especially talking about, because I'm pretty sure that when you're talking about Mosul, or when you're talking about areas where you've had a presence for 20 years, like you were more referring to, those parameters make a difference in how we look at that question of humanitarian, linking up humanitarian aid to development. Now, without more ado, I'm now going to hand over, and we will have, as our first speaker, as I mentioned, we will have Peter Felten from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Germany. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Thea. In your introduction, you opened almost a box of Pandora, I would say, addressing so many issues that it's difficult to remain silent on some of them, having only 5 minutes. But still, I think what we are talking about basically, and what we are understanding much better now than a couple of years ago, is that we need a comprehensive approach to crises. We were talking about in the past linking relief, rehabilitation and development as a sequence of things. We have overcome this understanding, but we should not forget that there was also in parallel somehow a discussion about the interrelationship of development and security and peace, not forgetting Kofi Annan 2005 saying there can be no development without security and no security without development. And in my understanding, this came together in the World Humanitarian Summit, which took place under the impression that humanitarian needs keep growing, that humanitarian situations never end, and that despite all efforts to increase humanitarian funding and increase the capacity of humanitarian actors, we will be unable to close the gap from the supply side, so to speak. We simply, as humanitarians, cannot keep pace. And so one of the major outcomes of the World Humanitarian Summit was that, yes, humanitarian assistance must be more effective and efficient. You mentioned the grand bargain. But that at the same time more needs to be done to reduce the demand for humanitarian assistance, that is to reduce humanitarian need. Not only addressing humanitarian need, but preventing humanitarian needs from arising, reducing existing humanitarian needs and ending humanitarian needs by finding solutions to the humanitarian situations. And this is of paramount importance, and bringing all these instruments that are required for such a comprehensive approach together, this is the essence of the humanitarian development peace nexus, which is the new catchword, I believe, that we are discussing now. So we are not only talking about humanitarian assistance, we are talking about politics, about diplomacy, about crisis prevention, about stabilization, post-conflict peace building, humanitarian assistance, and development cooperation. Now, the nexus, how linking them up somehow. It's not rocket science, and I believe it does not require revolutionary changes to the system, because the first step, where we still need to work a lot on, is the readiness of the different actors to talk to each other and to take into account what the other one is doing, why he is doing it, and what is his modus operandi none of those stabilization actors, development actors, humanitarian actors should work in splendid isolation. And actually the humanitarians should be the first ones to talk to everybody in the best interest of the beneficiaries. We need more sharing and exchange of information between the different actors. We should work towards a joint analysis so that all actors have the same understanding of the situation and somehow work from the same basis. And all actors, while working towards their respective goals, need to design their projects in a way that takes into account what the others are doing. For example, for the humanitarians, design their projects in a way that facilitates the takeover by development actors as soon as sustainable approaches become possible, and carefully avoid that the way humanitarian projects for protection and assistance are designed and delivered inadvertently prolong the humanitarian situation. And what is also key in coming to a better nexus implementation is that development actors come in earlier, and the initiatives of the World Bank in the context of fragility are a good example. They come in earlier, they are not waiting for complete stability, but they start working as soon as developmental approaches, the building of structures, sustainable approaches become possible. However, nexus is not mixus. So closer cooperation and coordination between the different instruments must allow all the different instruments and actors involved to work towards their respective goals and according to their respective mandates. Otherwise, they will not be effective, and there is a risk that there will be unhealthy competition and rivalry, and in some areas we start seeing that this could happen. And when I look at one of these instruments, which is the humanitarian assistance, this means that humanitarian assistance must, with all the linking up and coordination, remain able to live up to its one and only goal, to save lives, to reduce suffering, and to preserve human dignity, and to do so for whoever needs such protection and assistance, and as long as it takes to do so. This is the ambition, and we cannot abdicate from that ambition. And this is why we emphasize the relevance of the humanitarian principles, not for their own sake, but because this is the ambition: protection and assistance for whoever needs it, without any discrimination, with particular attention to the most vulnerable and those most in need. And to be able to do so, not taking sides or becoming a party, and making sure that humanitarian assistance is not instrumentalized for other goals. This is, I believe, what humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence means. Now, how to achieve this might depend on the context. For example, whether the authorities in the country we are talking about really intend to provide services equitably to all the population under their responsibility, or whether the other extreme, they are even party or the reason for the conflict that has caused the humanitarian situation. So, how to ensure humanity and impartiality in humanitarian assistance has a lot to do with the context. And therefore, for implementing the nexus, there is no one-size-fits-all. We need to test it in the field, and this is what is happening. I'm making reference only, for example, to the Humanitarian Development Peace Initiative of the UN and the World Bank, which is going on as a pilot, for example, in Sudan, in Somalia, in Yemen. Or I'm also making reference to the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. You were addressing refugees quite a lot, which emanates from the New York Declaration and which presents a comprehensive approach to refugee situations with a particular emphasis on bringing them to an end, on offering, developing solutions for the refugees. Now, how are we addressing this in Germany? You made reference to the different instruments and where they are institutionally. So we strongly subscribe to this concept of comprehensively addressing crises. And what are we doing? First, we are actively participating in the international discussion on the issues. My Director General is at the World Bank meetings today, where the nexus and the role of the World Bank in supporting governments in taking their role with regard to refugees, for example, is an issue again. There's an OECD discussion. The Good Humanitarian Donorship Initiative is discussing it, and I will be there on Monday for a discussion on the implementation of the nexus. Then second, we have the whole toolbox ready, I would say. And there are substantive budget lines to underpin it. We have in the Foreign Office the instruments of conflict prevention, of stabilization, post-conflict management. We also have in the Foreign Office, of course, the Humanitarian Assistance, and meaning not only emergency aid, emergency assistance, but the whole range from the humanitarian disaster risk reduction and preparedness over the emergency aid, the longer-term assistance, and the humanitarian demining. And indeed, we have in the Ministry for the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the instrument of development cooperation, and something which does not exist in many countries, which is the developmental transition aid, which is especially there to follow developmental approaches where the situations are still fragile and the situations are still complicated. So what we are doing is, in the first place, to bring our instruments into the international coordinated mechanisms. For humanitarian assistance, it's quite obvious, because we want to make our contribution to addressing humanitarian needs that have been systematically assessed and that have been reflected in a humanitarian response plan, as well as in the appeals of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. We are supporting comprehensively the CRRF approach, politically, with the pilot countries, institutionally supporting UNHCR in taking its coordination role, and through our humanitarian assistance, transition aid and development cooperation tailored to this comprehensive approach, for example, in Uganda. And we will also start a national pilot shortly to even more deepen coordination and cooperation between the instruments we have at our disposal. And this again will not be a revolution, because we think this is not what is needed. It will be even better exchange of information, joint analysis, and ensuring full complementarity of our activities, up to where it makes sense, designing projects on the humanitarian side, on the transitional development side, in a way that allows for linking up German transition aid or development projects to German humanitarian assistance. And as there is quite a number of German NGOs, for example, that are working both on humanitarian assistance and on development cooperation, they will be an important, interesting partner on this endeavor. So, to wrap this up, the discussion about linking humanitarian assistance and development, and including the peace dimension, is more important than ever, and we see tangible progress on that at the international and at the national level, and we really want to contribute to that. Thank you.
Great, Peter. Thank you very much. You're allowed to acknowledge the speech. And I thought it's really great. There's the one line that I will never ever forget anymore. Nexus is not mixus. That is a very nice way of putting this. And I also think it's very great that you brought in peace into the equation. That the panel should be maybe, it's humanitarian aid and development, but perhaps also and peace. Now let's move straight to the next speaker. And I welcome Carla Mardini.
Thank you. So you've just had the perspective of the German government, and now you're going to have the perspective of an international organization, so the International Committee of the Red Cross, that is working in specifically in armed conflicts and situations of violence. I'm going to throw at you a few things based on evidence and what we see happening in the field, but bear in mind this is the perspective of the ICRC, so you need to really analyze everything you hear and make your own judgment on that. To caricature what has happened so far, we've always had this spectrum of, you start with a conflict, there's emergency life-saving work, then there's early recovery, you've mentioned that, the phase of early recovery, then hopefully there's a peace process, and hopefully development agencies will come into that area and rebuild the country with the government. The reality on the ground, and we've seen it in the past years, is not that. And we've lived with the illusion of the sequencing of, at some point, humanitarian agencies will exit a given context and then, hand over to development agencies. The reality is that conflicts are becoming protracted. So if you look at our involvement in different areas like Afghanistan, Syria is still fairly new, 6-7 years, but Iraq, Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, on average, were 30 years in these contexts. So at some point you wonder, when do we exit? So there's no such thing as exit. Actually, the whole strategy of humanitarian organizations is how do you anchor yourself so you're ready and prepared for flare-ups, because these contexts, they go through different cycles. I'm just sharing this with you just so that we perhaps get away from the illusion of having that sequencing. And perhaps and that's my personal perspective now, we've never had that sequencing if you look at the reality on the ground. So this artificial dichotomy or binary creates a lot of problems because governments and ODA, official development assistance, is structured along this binary. So you have big development budgets, a smaller pot for humanitarian action, and what's happened in recent years is, this is debatable, but let's say more and more complex crises that are protracted. I won't say more needs because that's being debated. Where are there more needs today than before? But this, we can have another debate on that. But what's happening is that these crises are protracted. And the problem is emergency organizations are seen in the world as, short-termist, short-sighted, you're doing Band-Aid work, you're not doing sustainable stuff, you're not preparing the population to be more resilient. And that development work, and this is really a binary, is more long-term, sustainable, efficient, restructuring through the government, building infrastructure. The reality on the ground, and I'll tell you what happens from really frontline work, is that ICRC and other organizations, but specifically from our work, from day one, when we start in an armed conflict, you have long-term activities that are taking place at the same time, simultaneously. So if you look at Syria, so you're doing frontline work and life-saving work, whilst at the same time working on water boards, infrastructure, making sure health facilities do not crumble completely, as is the case today in Yemen, so that you don't have epidemics, because these humanitarian agencies are kind of protecting the little development holes that are still remaining in these contexts. So the work of the ICRC is not just emergency and relief. There's a lot of work linked to prevention, protection, and also infrastructure work that looks like development activities. So long-term work in rehabilitating health infrastructure, water infrastructure. You can't just keep trucking water to 2-3 million people. You need to work with the authorities and the water boards to make that more sustainable. So that's just to give you a perspective on how we feel when these dichotomies are put up there. And I was in the US recently, and a scholar was describing that. And the way he's described this dichotomy, I mean, we were like, oh my God, this is absolutely not the reality on the ground. So there is this wishful thinking of, two different worlds that don't talk to one another. And actually, it's true. There's a gap in between. Let's come back to Syria. Today, when our director of operations or our operational people go to the field and they ask the victims of armed conflict or the beneficiaries, or if we don't use victims or beneficiaries, the people affected, that's what we're saying now. We ask them, what are your needs? What do you think they say? They don't say water, they don't say health. I mean, education, because it's been 6 years. Their kids are out of school. They're displaced because some of them have become refugees, but there are 7 million displaced inside Syria. And so you hear them, they say education. And we're an organization that wants to be accountable to the people. So we need to design a program that is based on their needs. So they're saying education, we're not an education provider. What do we do? Is there anyone providing education? No, in Syria today. So there's a gap. Where are the development agencies? They can't operate in Syria because you need to operate through the government, and you know the dynamics and the political dynamics around that. Whereas humanitarian organizations will work across different sides, speak to all sides to an armed conflict. So there is a gap in between. No one is saying we need to become a development agency. ICRC will never become a development agency, and development will not do emergency humanitarian work. But there's this space in between that is very tricky. It's a wicked problem, actually. It's a wicked problem that no one has managed to resolve. So you hear all kinds of things. The World Bank saying we're going to invest in fragile states, but when you look at the countries they're investing in, You know, it's been recent, it's just recent thing, the investments in Lebanon and Jordan. Lebanon and Jordan had the biggest influxes of refugees, were not benefiting from humanitarian aid because they weren't in open armed conflict situation, and were not benefiting from development aid. And then the World Bank had to review its systems to be able to give them loans without the interest rates and the whole thing. So there is a lot of reflection on that space in between and how we can bridge that gap. And so it's mainly in these fragile environments. Last few points before coming back to Q&A later. I just wanted to take the example of Yemen. Yemen, I mean, when you look at the cholera epidemic there, whilst we're managing this emergency, we're also getting into the country insulin and or dialysis equipment, because many children are dying from, you know, preventable diseases. This is the crazy thing, is often you have people dying, of course, from bombing and shelling and everything, but also from preventable diseases, because the infrastructure, the health infrastructure is completely collapsing. And that also, that piece of work is being carried out by humanitarian actors, and they're not necessarily funded for it. So you get funding in general for the emergency, the stuff that is really headlines in the media, which is normal because that's what drives funding and it's good. But then how do we fund all those kind of more long-term projects that will protect the development goals and make it possible for development at some point to enter in these contexts? So I'll stop here and come back to these points later.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to share my experience as working for a local NGO in Iraq, specialized in health. In the 2016, the process of liberation of Nineveh region had been started to get rid of ISIS outside of Iraq. We've been working on this in the face of the humanitarian aid. So we found at the end of the liberation of the city, there was a great need to development actors to start to do the assessment for the needs and also to continue their plan for the development program in the region. But unfortunately, this didn't start till this moment, and it is not started. And we are planning to coordinate more on this issue. The link between the rehabilitation, relief rehabilitation and development, and the gap in funding was very clear in this phase. I will give a hospital as an example in the Mosul city. During the liberation, a part of the city was more than 5 months under the siege, and the other area was liberated. So what happened? People start to return to the original place, and at the same time there was a war conflict inside the city. There was a relief actors to provide the primary health cares, but the secondary health cares and the tertiary health cares facilities had been destructed, and there was no humanitarian actor to start the support because of the security region in the area. So what happened? There was one hospital that had been supported by basic things in order to provide these services, but still there was a need for many other things for the people to get the treatment. For example, they had to travel 2 or 3 hours outside the city to go to another region to do simple investigations for themselves in order to reach a diagnosis of their disease. So this funding gap had been appeared very clear in this phase between the rehabilitation and the development. So I would like to mention that maybe the reasons for this, the humanitarian aid phase and partially the rehabilitation, which is the transitional phase between the development, they have different goals and objectives, and they are different in mandates, and also they are different in the implementation modes. So this will make the challenges to get rid of this on the ground, and other things to find a solution for that. We think there was an experience that happened in the Horn of Africa. They form a joint humanitarian development framework. They work on this to solve the problem in that area. So they decided to integrate different views, analysis of ongoing and planned interventions, and identification of strategic priorities. So they combined and they build resilience to food insecurity and malnutrition to avoid large-scale disasters. The humanitarian aid, the link between the humanitarian aid and relief, rehabilitation, and development theoretically had been discussed many times in many debates since 1990. Many professionals work on this to develop this, but unfortunately still on the operational wise, still there is funding gap when they want to implement the projects, when they want to implement the program. And this still appear in some area in the world. And I think there was a good example of the earthquake in Haiti. There was a very gap between the development program and the humanitarian relief. Thank you very much.
All right, I promised to Thea to stick to my 5-minute speaking time. I'll try my best. So I'm from Médecins du Monde, Germany, a member of the board. But I have to admit that I will not be speaking only about my knowledge and experiences about Médecins du Monde, but about quite a number of different organizations that I've been working with, and also about my other life as a researcher in global health and humanitarian aid. Because then a lot of other ministries start to jump in. If you want to do research in global health, then you have the German Ministry for Research and Science, you have the Ministry for Health, all of a sudden having a say as soon as you start to touch refugees, for example. Médecins du Monde, we are active in more than 80 countries, and so we have numerous projects in these different countries. But what I would like to point out is that Médecins du Monde deliberately has put into its list of principles harm reduction, sustainability, and development. And I would like to give some examples where Médecins du Monde has tried to implement this, and also in a parallel fashion. It's up to you to decide how well we were actually able to do this at Médecins du Monde together with our colleagues in the field. I'm the last in the row, so a lot of things have been said that I wanted to pick up, so there's no point to pick them up again, but at least I'll take the chance then to refer to some of the things that have been said before. I completely agree with what has been said by Carla, is that this sequential series of you have relief and then rehabilitation and then you hand it over to development, that this has not been seen, probably never seen, and that we need to think about what do we have to do about this. And we believe that you have to address these things really in parallel. Yeah. So when you go into a certain area and you see, okay, so there has been a disaster, or there has been an open conflict, that you already think about how can we do our things in the relief area in a way that then later on we can directly have already a basis for the rehabilitation efforts, and then in the end maybe develop something that the local partner then can take over. I'm also very happy that Nabaz is next to me because it is very true that a lot of the mostly long-term sustainable activities that Médecins du Monde is really doing would not be possible without the local partners. And sometimes I'm really wondering, when we're talking about conflict, highly risky situations, how many of these local partners there are actually, because I think it seems to me all the NGOs that there are somehow resorting to these partners, and sometimes I'm wondering how many of them there are still. To give an example that has been brought up in this conference before is the Central African Republic. I mean, I have to assume that maybe not all of you are aware of that, but you know, it's a very scarcely populated country. 4.9 million inhabitants, but twice the size of Germany. 16% of children don't make it up to their 5th birthday, and 1 in 100 women will die due to a complication of a delivery. So this is really a very tough situation in terms of indicators if you only look at these. But also if you look at this scarce population, it's a phantom state. The state powers only exist within the capital, within a reach of 100 kilometers maybe, but as soon as you get out of there, you have different warlords, different fractions, you have different defending agencies, and you have to deal with them. And you may know, you may not know that by the end of 2012, 2013, there was the Celica movement running across the country. And so you had it all there. Yeah, so it was all a question of relief work. There were, in the year 2015, an assessment, more than 12,000 rapings in women, because there is no state power trying to put order into the country and to sanction what is happening there. Yeah, so there are we are dealing with people in refuge, displaced people, internally displaced people, but also about sexual, gender-based violence in the country. At the same time, over the time, and also before that incidents in 2012 and 13, we have tried to equip the different health centers that are in place, because very often you have some infrastructure, you have people that are willing to work, but they have no equipment. Yeah, what can you do if you have people that have not had a salary and they don't have the drugs? We don't even talk about quality of the treatments. So trying to equip these places with the materials so that they actually can work then in the end. Yeah? So here we are talking about the rehabilitation procedure. Yeah? The 2012-13 happening in the Central African Republic was not the first one. It's just one in a series, and it's probably going to happen over and over again. In Togo, that's another country in the western part of Africa, Médecins du Monde, this is particularly the German section that has been busy there, has been educating midwives. The northern part of Togo is really having a huge structural problem. At the coastline, where the capital is, of course, yeah, you find the doctors, the infrastructure, everything there. But Togo, again, is suffering from a large maternal mortality. Under 5 mortality is a lot better than in CAR, but still, it's 8% of children that die by the age of 5. So midwives have been trained in the country, particularly from the northern part, and to be deployed to the northern part to actually take care of the complications of delivery and also of the problems of early childhood. And then in Gaza, and I really like this project that I got much deeper into now in these few days, meeting colleagues and people from Gaza. One example where actually this link between resilience, capacity building, rehabilitation, but then also having something at hand that can then work in case of a relief situation, an acute emergency. That's the emergency training. Yeah, and so MDM claims we're doing participatory approach. I think we're doing quite a good job, but it's up to you to judge. But the local staff was pretty clear that in case something happens, they're not very well trained in how to deal with an emergency situation. Yeah, something that you have to have a lot of training if you are an emergency doctor in Germany is to do triage, to say in which state are the people, where do we transport them, to know what kind of infrastructure can actually take care of them if the infrastructure is still there. So an emergency training, basic life support was conducted with staff on the Palestinian territories. And people were probably thinking, well, why do you do this? Don't they have other problems to do, basic life support? It's questionable, what the outcome is for patients if then further down the line the intensive care treatment is not available. But then in 2014, military operations came, and then you had the emergency. Yeah, so you had to have a relief action, and as we heard before, it takes a long time. And so now we could resort on the locally trained staff that we were probably training, having in mind things like road traffic injuries and things like this. And you have a military operation, all of a sudden you can resort to these newly trained people to act in an acute situation. What are the challenges that we are facing? Well, it's the sectoralism. Yeah, so we have to deal with the different funding agencies, accountability towards these agencies, the suitability of the toolboxes that are being used. So we're constantly trying at MDM to really get in parallel these different lines of having relief tools at hand, but also to take care of the rehabilitation of the system, and then to be able to provide a sustainable development, or at least a share of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I thought the speeches were really very interesting, also in their combination, and to see how one of the things I found very striking is sort of a consensus that responses during emergency is not just about protecting people, but it's also about protecting, or at least not destroying further, the remaining infrastructure for local service delivery. But then that stands in rather sharp contrast with what you're telling and your story from Mosul, where it shows, well, actually all the story shows that those more longer-term development concerns find it very difficult to be financed as well. That's one of the messages I get actually from all three of you. Now, I would like immediately to open the floor. So who would like to start? Either raising a question or just telling something and adding something to this debate or making some contribution. And can you please introduce yourself, because this is all being streamed outside, so people know who is talking.
My name is Cecilia. I work for MSF. I would like to know, and I can understand the concept of course, if you have an acute situation, you will also damage the chronic, let's say, the development that that region had before. And I just came back from Mosul region, so I think in Iraq it's very clear that they have the capacity to respond, but at the same time, at some point we had many NGOs doing trauma response, and we could see a huge gap in primary health care in the region a bit further from Mosul. I was a bit southern. And so for me, it's just hard from a practical standpoint on how do we measure? I mean, in Mosul, it was a clear emergency situation, but there was a need also to start some sort of development, exactly to avoid all this. So what's the balance in between the emergency situation that for us, especially in MSF, I think it's easy. We have a quick and easy response to this and this and this, but then it's exactly this limbo between this emergency or this process that it's not really a process, but I don't know if I was clear.
No, very clear. Thank you. So the question is really, okay, this is really nice, but how do you do that in practice? How do you sort of divide your energy between the more primary responses and the more development-oriented responses? Before we go back to the panel, is there somebody who also wanted to react specifically on this aspect?
Tankert Stebe, MSF. My question goes to Peter Felton, also in that sort of similar thing. I mean, I liked what you said, but it sounded a little bit too much of a nice political speech. Sorry to be a bit blunt here, but I would sort of ask you to be a bit more, maybe sort of exposing also the dilemmas you see in your area of command, sort of also the dilemma between the two ministries who have a very different budget, very different agenda, who deal with development and humanitarian aid in the German government. Just sort of as a reminder with Ebola, where there was a clear lack of coordination between the two, and I remember we had 2 invitations on a single day about white helmets from the 2 different ministries, and there was clearly a lack of coordination and cooperation. So can you maybe expose a little bit the dilemmas you see, maybe from your Foreign Office, in responding to the acute needs we see? And I'm just coming back from Yemen, which is clearly a political conflict where I see not a big of an engagement of German politics in order to help resolving that conflict. Thank you.
I think we go back to the panel because both questions are quite related. You want to say something on this particular topic? Then go ahead. I will watch you, eh? If it doesn't connect, we will switch off We will switch off the sound
If it doesn't
system.
connect, I'll apply for asylum somewhere else. Thank you. Per Biemer, NRC Germany. I think it's quite interesting when you mentioned the funding thing, because I think the humanitarian organizations out there on the front line, I think they're actually quite aware of the need for flexibility and also foresight, as Mr. Felton mentioned, that we in our planning. I think also in general that the humanitarian donors tend to be more flexible and have much more of an understanding when it comes to this. I mean, I come from the donor side before, spent 13 years with Swedish SIDA. But there, of course, there's also a limit to the flexibility even of the most flexible and best humanitarian donor. Now, for instance, Sweden, coming back, has a very comprehensive Syria strategy, covers both humanitarian and development. And even if it's not perfect, but it does enable development donors also to be a bit more flexible when looking at what they otherwise could fund. So my question is basically to Mr. Felton, could you explain a bit more about the German development side, how the BMZ is looking at this kind of flexibility also, because I know there are interesting things happening there. And to Ms. Mardini, what would you say in general is being done by donors or actually by the organizations to increase the flexibility from the donors to move away from this silo thinking?
Okay, so this is really not so much about new policies, new pilots, but really about how the combination between development and humanitarianism works in an everyday kind of way, and how donors and perhaps also agencies can be more flexible in shifting and integrating approaches in their everyday practices. So let's go back to the panel. So I think you have to start. There were 2 questions directed to you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it is a process. And you mentioned Ebola, and you are right, but we have made progress. We have learned from it, and we will continue learning. And the international system is learning. There is nothing perfect. And when I ended my presentation by saying there is tangible progress, then the progress might be small, but things are going into the right direction because we are much more than 5-10 years ago developing the understanding of how important it is to make sure these things are interlinked. The major dilemma, I would say, is that funding is never sufficient, and that while being the second largest humanitarian donor and a large development donor, still we have a real problem to somehow address all the situations adequately that we want to address. Now we have these different budget lines, and yes, they are not flexible because the German Parliament has allocated funding for stabilization, has allocated funding for humanitarian assistance, has allocated funding for development cooperation. Now one thing I'm really sure about is if this were one big pot, the pot would be much smaller, and we would have much more difficulties to ensure that the different dimensions can be properly addressed than it is now. On the other hand, this brings the issue of coordination. And yes, it is a process. We need to improve. This pilot I was talking about will improve. However, on the other side, there is continuous dialogue and discussion on the country situations, exchange, discussions on how we can link development or transitional aid projects with humanitarian projects. And, as I said, it is not our intention as Germany, although being a large donor, to try to solve the problems of the world on our own. So a key issue, not least from the humanitarian perspective, is from the stabilization perspective, development perspective also, is to contribute to an internationally coordinated approach to these problems. I said humanitarian assistance for Iraq this year only 100 million euro, which is a lot, but still the dilemmas are there as you were describing them, because we cannot solve coordination problems nationally that need to be addressed at the international level. However, through policy and discussion and participation in the fora, we can try to work towards bringing this better together.
Right, so maybe, yeah.
Just a couple of points. So if you look at humanitarian agencies and how they're funded, let's take ICRC, we're 95% funded by governments, because governments are signatories of the Geneva Conventions, and they have a role to invest in the independence of the organization as an organization that will move across front lines, talk to all sides to a party. It's in the interest of everyone. But so the funding comes primarily from the humanitarian pot in ministries. Most of our monies come from whoever is the funder. We are funded primarily by Western governments, but also we're happy to announce that we had Kuwait and UAE join our donor support group, and we have Japan as part of the donor support group, but we want to diversify that donor base. But what I wanted to say is if you look at the current pie of public funding for humanitarian action, it's either the same size or shrinking because there's less. And it's that same pie where all the UN agencies, ICRC, everyone is competing within that pie, and everyone wants to get the biggest share of that pie, which is logical. So there is something there to reflect upon. But then there's another pie, which could be slightly bigger, which is where you can connect the dots with development finance. Doesn't mean we're going to go and be development funded, because development funding is conditioned sometimes. It has different reporting mechanisms. It's a different model. But as you were saying, they could flexibilize, if I can use that term, their funding too, to be able to intervene in places where they cannot intervene otherwise, because either there's no government in that country or the government is collapsing, and invest through organizations like ICRC. So that bigger pie is where there could be a reflection on how we could join the dots in ministries so that some of the development finance can feed into either the humanitarian pot or actions that look like development activities that are carried out by humanitarians in fragile or conflict-affected contexts.
I would like to answer Cecilia, right? Yeah, I know MSF were the first to respond in Mosul, in both trauma care and in Mosul Hospital, both in the east side and the west side. My point is, the country, when undergo the war, they will spend money to fight. And this is what happened for the central Iraq and also for the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So the capacity to respond for the humanitarian was very limited, and the capacity to respond for the development program is none, okay? So the actors on the development, they should respond quickly. This is what I'm trying to focus on this, and I brought it as an example, because even if you wait for 2 years and without any development actors come, still there will be no implementation of the programs in the area, because we know the country is suffering from the loan from different region, and now there is escalating of the politics things between different parties in the area. Still ISIS on the west side of the country. So all of these provide the conditions which is not suitable for the country to start to implement of developmental program. This is one thing. The other thing is, the humanitarian actors, they respond in the short term only and not the long term. And that was another reason that there was no humanitarian actors. They can combine development programs during their work. Even the local NGO, they develop something like training, capacity building of the staff, but it is just very minor things during the work. So that was another reason to make a gap in this phase between the development and between the humanitarian aid.
Okay, it seems like we have here on the table as well quite some different experiences on how that long-term, short-term is working out in practice. And from your experience, it seems that the sequential gaps are still very much alive, that the rest of us think we have to some extent overcome. Now, my neighbor likes to say something about that as well.
Only very briefly, this long-term, short-term thing. And it appears in UN documents which are talking about short-term humanitarian assistance and long-term development assistance, which in my view is a completely wrong terminology, and it increases the gap instead of closing it. Our understanding of humanitarian assistance is that it needs to be provided as long as sustainable structure building, developmental approaches are not necessary. And in a situation, let's say in a refugee camp, where people are not allowed to work, are not allowed to go out, where there's no short-term perspective that they can go home, humanitarian assistance might last 30 years if necessary, at least certain aspects. So we must make sure that the Nexus discussion does not lead us to reducing humanitarian assistance to emergency aid and then being surprised that the gap does not close. We need to make sure that humanitarian assistance is funded and is conceptualized in a way that addresses all along the humanitarian needs, and in parallel, and you called it overlap, which I didn't really like because it's different things, I would say, in parallel to developmental approaches wherever they are possible. There are different needs, and we need to make sure that the different instruments at our disposal are used properly to addressing all of them.
Okay, thank you for the feedback. And yeah, François.
Yeah, Group URD has been working on this subject for the last 35 years, and we are quite happy to see that those points are now clearly and well set on the table. So I think there is a big progress in the last 5-6 years in clarifying all those issues. So this is a big progress, we have to take note of it. The next trap is, after the humanitarian development nexus, we see the rise of the humanitarian development security nexus. And this is now part of many of the debates in Sahel, in Syria, etc. And this is extremely dangerous. This is extremely dangerous because it is like if most of those crises are linked to a security problem. In fact, the security problem, and that would be interesting to see the vision of Germany on that, because we are very active also in that debate. The security problem is a symptom of something else. And most of the time, is a symptom of the absence of law and order. I was in Kabul when the Taliban arrived in the city. Somalia, the same with the Islamic Tribunal, and now central Mali. The problem is not security, it's absence of law and justice and prevalence of corruption, which affect all the strata of the society, which gets the conflicts running and gets us poor humanitarians having to help. And the system is responding to that by bringing more guns and more boots rather than more judge and more law. And this will become our next biggest problem. So now we have to, I think the debate on LLRG, whatever we call it, nexus, etc., I think I reach a very interesting level of maturity. Now the critical challenge will be the next step.
Thank you. This is going back a little bit to the idea that the nexus is also related to peace building. So is it peace building and rule of law? On the other hand, that can slip into some very clunky security thinking, which is very different. So is there somebody who wants to add something on this particular topic? And, or yeah, in the back we have a lady who likes to comment on François.
Thank you for that opportunity. My name is Naomi from Friedenthal University. I think we all here, to a larger extent, agree that humanitarian aid, to a larger extent, bring about development. But on the other side of the coin, we realize that humanitarian aid is being politicized, where donor countries are dumping aid to developing countries in return for favor. What do we do about this situation? Thank you.
So you also bring in, and that's largely favors, I think, to stop migration as well, eh? Probably. So, yeah, let's go here to Florian, and I can give my mic to him here.
A little bit in the same direction, sorry. Florian Westphal of MSF Germany. Because we've talked now largely about the humanitarian and development domains in quite technical terms. We've talked a lot about donor relationships and everything else. But at the end of the day, the one, in a way, obstacle that still remains is that development is inherently a political project, as it should be. It's generally a political project that depends and should be driven by the host government of the country concerned. Now, when we're talking about countries at conflict, very typically the host government doesn't necessarily control the whole country. Very often, rightly or wrongly, its legitimacy is doubtful. And if you intervene, especially as a powerful donor or development actor from the outside, you're probably going to do that not just with development in mind. So, you know, I'm just curious to hear from the panel a little bit about how, while, you know, increasing mutual understanding and information sharing, and how we still protect, though, the essence that should enable humanitarian aid to work in these polarized situations where development will be taking sides, because that's in the nature of the beast.
Well, it may be in the nature of the beast, but I think we have to keep the distinction that François is bringing in, that on the other hand, some neutral type of development that can restore some level of rule of law might be very necessary in parallel. So it's a very strong dilemma that you're raising, huh? The geopolitics and the way we can organize development in parallel to humanitarianism.
Yeah, Ulrike van Pilar, also from MSF, and I just wanted to tie in with Florian because it was a similar question in a way to Peter Felten and Carla, because I was a little struck by the kind of normalcy with which you, Peter Felten, presented the comprehensive approach as the most desirable model, including humanitarian action. And I think many of you know MSF has for a long time tried to make clear that we don't see it that way, and that I actually personally think it contradicts the humanitarian principles. So there is a logical and a political problem. And in that context, I would like to ask Carla, I know the ICRC has also positioned itself quite clearly very often on the comprehensive approach. Maybe you could comment on that too. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's time to go back to the panel. We start with Carla this time, and I think maybe Guenter, you also like to say something about this political stuff.
So I think you've summed up, it's great to hear this from the audience because you've summed up all the different facets of the dilemma. So let's be clear, most of the budget is funded today, ICRC's budget is funded by humanitarian aid, which is flexible, essentially unearmarked or loosely earmarked funding to preserve the independence, where we can, operate on a needs-based approach. That's, we have to protect the humanitarian principles and a principled approach. Otherwise, as Florian said, it's jeopardized. The thing is, with development, the way they fund is on project base with a social change agenda in general, which is legitimate in situations where you are more stable, let's say Madagascar or Vietnam or places like that. It gets very tricky in armed conflict situations. And so we will not lose our religion or our soul and go for any type of funding to fund operations. I mean, when we talk about a dialogue between the two pots or the two sides of the coin, is to look at where the gaps are and how we can do something there. But we cannot go for funding that is tainted, or this would jeopardize our access actually on all sides of front lines. So that's one thing. And neutral and independent humanitarian action is something that we need to preserve and protect. So that's something clear. Just on the securitization of aid, you can see it. I mean, the international community is talking about the return of refugees, and so if we fund projects there, this will allow them to return. Let's not forget the non-refoulement principle, so refugees cannot return unless they want to, and let's think about the fact that they need to have a choice to return, and what would they return for if in the country nothing is left. So we need to really invest in the infrastructure during the conflicts in these situations to allow for that choice in the future. But we need to really clarify the different approaches. I think we really need to preserve the different modus operandi of humanitarian and development. It's just that link where it's protracted, where there is a space, where there are gaps, where we need to look at how they can also invest in a principled approach. We would not go for any type of, and actually ICRC has for the first time had a deal with the World Bank for Somalia, where we don't speak the same language, so the World Bank and ICRC don't speak the same language. It took months of discussions and negotiations, and we put firmly our red lines. So it is something that is not an easy task. I mean, it's something we need to really work on.
Yeah, because you just said in your previous contribution, you actually said that usually you're there for 30 years. So it is difficult to see how you can be somewhere for 30 years without an agenda for social change.
Agenda for social change. If you look at the reality of these conflicts, because of the fact that they're protracted, you're actually doing both at the same time, the emergency part of the work in certain areas of the country and more kind of development-like activities in other areas of the country simultaneously, but in a bit to provide what is needed by the people. So the approach is really people-based. Is what are the needs of the people? If they've moved from I need water or shelter or food to I need vaccines or I need insulin for my kids because they're dying of chronic diseases, this is where we adapt the approach. But there is no social change agenda on the ICRC part. It's purely humanitarian.
Guenter.
Ulrike, thank you very much, because I completely agree that, however you want to integrate developmental issues into whatever you're doing, that you have to be really strict with the principles that you are abiding to. And unfortunately, a lot of agencies, be it NGOs, but also from my academic side, it's the same thing. Somehow you have to twist and turn because the funding situation, sometimes you are dependent on that, are just giving you sort of barriers and hurdles that somehow you try to still make something out of it to have a good result for the population at stake. And I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Is there somebody on the panel who likes to say something, or shall we do another round with the audience? Maybe, yeah? Let's go all the way to the back there. Somebody in a blue T-shirt likes to say something, and then there is a lady in the back who also likes to speak. I have a feeling this is going to be the last round of questions, so we just take a few comments from the audience, and then I will give one more round to the panel members, and then we close it off. So this is your time to say what you have to say.
Hi, this is on? Yeah. So I had a question about turning the other side, where the politics of the donor countries and how that affects, how that's affecting both the development priorities, but also the funds. For example, like the US now has decided to cut, I think, $1 billion out of their development funds. And how also like changes on the ground, whether it's the changes in politics or changes in regimes, how that then translates back to decisions that are made when allocating the funding. And some concrete examples would be great, like, because there's so many places that's happening right now, like what's happening in Myanmar with, on the one hand, we have Aung San Suu Kyi being supported and sort of idealized by the West, but at the same time, the Rohingya crisis, which then makes us question what we're doing there. So,
yeah, we go to the back.
Yeah, hi. My question is to Mr. Felton, and I thank Carla Mardini for the introduction of saying ICRC has a broader chance to use the funding because you are more flexible. My ideas are we are facing this BMZ and AA funding, and you said that we have two pots, and these two pots are perhaps bigger when we have the two and not one. But we have other examples like DFID or like NORAD, and other governments are giving funds as well in terms of 5-year funding for organizations. And they have programs that they can build up and say, okay, we have a program that might include humanitarian aid and as well development aspects. We have to justify what we are doing, but we are more free and we are away from this 1 year or 2, 3, 4 years funding. So this is an idea what is happening here in Germany, for example, to think a bit more about flexible funding.
Okay. Somebody else likes to say, yeah, and all the way up there.
Thanks, Katharina from GIZ, and I'm not really having a question, but a suggestion or a comment. When looking at your title, I quite miss some development actors on the panel, and I think there's a massive need that we start talking to each other instead of talking about each other. So I think it's a missed opportunity if humanitarian aid actors are talking about development and vice versa. So suggestion for next time or next year to invite the other side. Thank you.
Development in this case.
Pardon me?
To have development actors, you mean?
Yes.
Let's go. Oh, I see quite a few now. We go there to the back, and then we have a question here. So maybe, yeah. No, there, and then if you can pass your mic to the gentleman in green.
This is a specific question to Carla. How are you suggesting to bridge the gap as the ICRC between development and humanitarian aid? Like, what concrete suggestions do you have for bridging the gap rather than just rhetoric? Could we have like an idea of how we would reshape humanitarianism?
Hi, I would like to continue with the question regarding funding of my colleague before. She got ignored, probably, actually. And so I would like to go back to that, because I have the opinion or the feeling that it's not going really well. It's more like a top-down development cooperation currently, and it's not really what we wanted to have, a bottom-up. And currently it's like a self-driven industry, and my question is, why do we still have the private sector as a tool used to maximize their own interest instead of actually doing their right job? And the other question is, why do we still have those neo-colonial structure instead of breaking it and doing it right?
Where is the, I saw one here. Yeah, here, let's have this one, and then I think we will go back to the panel.
Thank you very much. Khaled Kayali, Bochum University. Actually, I just want to comment on what Ms. Mardini said, and also it's touching what Mr. Al-Mirani said about the educational field in Syria. For example, you came to this point. Actually, there was some try in the educational field in Syria. There was one small organization called Hayat Al-Ilm. It's supported by private donors or something, and after that they had problems. It was about corruption. Some people was corrupted, and the donor just decided to stop the project. So, and there was no one like to fill out this gap. So the point for me, it's not only support the local organization, but also find a long-term funding or just someone to fill out this gap. We have the offices and we have the schools, but it's all left over. And the students who were studying for 1 year or 2 years already closed the school and had to find another place to study, where they already the schools has no capacity to receive more people, because they were, like what you said, 7 million people internally displaced. Thank you.
I think we go back to the panel now. There were quite a few questions. Is it okay if each of you take a turn and you try to address some of the questions and at the same time make your kind of closing argument, or is it too much to ask? I can also allocate some, but you will start, I think. I will keep an eye on whether there are things we still need to address. Yeah.
I hope I've captured everything, but if I didn't, I think the other panelists will complete. But on one of the questions regarding how can we do it, your question to, apart from the rhetoric and the semantics of it, how can we do it? There is a lot of talk with the regular donors, so the humanitarian agencies of the different governments on multi-year funding. And multi-year funding is very interesting because then when you're designing your budgets, you know what's pure relief emergency and the aspects that are more long-term, like prevention, protection work. When I say prevention, is all the work we do with the different sides to a conflict to explain what is international humanitarian law, the laws of war, why they should be respected, all the work that we do in terms of protection for the civilian population, but also long-term infrastructure work. And multi-year funding would allow us to secure over several years that chunk of money to make sure these programs are funded. Otherwise, you're always funding the, sorry for the term, sexiest stuff for the media, and the rest is not taken care of. So multi-year funding is one thing, and the other thing is joining the dots with development finance. It's really finding those areas where development agencies cannot operate, and coming to the point of Florian, where either you don't have a government or the government is very weak, and in any case they will operate through the government. So if they want to see development aspects maintained in that country, they have an independent actor that is accessing all sides and all areas to be able to invest in these projects or these parts of our operation that are long-term. This is wishful thinking. I mean, we're testing now. It's just the start. But that's a part where you can join the dots. The point is not to move full-fledged into development finance, not at all. But there is this space where you can start testing on how to bridge the gap, or invest in local, institutions like the national societies of some of the countries, like the Syrian Arab Red Crescent or other Red Crescents or Red Crosses that are there to stay in the long term and need some capacity building. So they are also carrying a big part of the burden. On another question, there was the whole issue of, some organizations on the spot that either you have issues on how they're delivering the aid. One thing about the way we operate, it's direct delivery in the field. So we don't go through implementing partners. We work closely with the national societies, the Red Cross or the Red Crescent of a country, and make sure we up their capacities. But also we have our own teams on the ground delivering the aid to be sure that it doesn't go in the wrong hands, and we can do the due diligence from the minute we design a program until the last mile delivery point. So that's important to note. Last point on the private sector. So there's a lot of talk on the PPPs, the famous private-public partnerships. There's a lot of talk about that, but actually very hard to find good examples of good practice or something that we can really use as an example. But we did launch a humanitarian impact bond on orthopedic rehab, physical rehabilitation work in terms of prosthesis and orthesis for people who lost their arm or their leg. We did launch this bond on a small scale just to see how you could attract private capital, kind of engage between outcome funders that are governments, private capital, on a program that we would not have funded otherwise, and scale it up. And we've designed that for 3 countries in Africa, Mali, DRC, and Nigeria, so quite fragile states. And we're testing that over a year, and we'll be able to say more in a year when we've had the full cycle. But there's very little being done in attracting also some of the private sector actors to be able to help out in some of the big wicked problems we have.
Thank you. Can you go to Guenter?
Yes. I like very much the idea of the multi-year funding, of having things like lump sum funding, where you have flexibility to that in the end choose what is important. This allows you to do the bottom-up approaches, because you don't have to serve to like an upper authority that you have to report to. And by the way, the reporting is really terrible. And I mean, I don't even want to think about the amount of human resources that is being wasted into all these reports that you have to write for. I have the impression smaller and smaller amounts that are being distributed for the amount of challenges that there are out there. I have to admit that an organization like Médecins du Monde, we are also a part of this humanitarian ecosystem. That is true. We are working also with private partners, private donors. They have their own agenda. Of course, you're always aware that you're doing some kind of advertisement for them, but we always try to believe in the true goodwill of some like high-level people that are having a say. But this is really important. We are trying to get as much funds from private individuals, but this is very much depending on the current situation of catastrophes in the world. And all of you know these peaks that are coming and going. As soon as there is an earthquake somewhere, then the funds pour in, and then you have the problems with bound donations that you are bound to actually spend into an area where actually you say, well, okay, it sounded really terrible on the news, but there's not too much that we can do actually with these funds. So yes, we are somehow stuck into this ecosystem, and we are trying to really abide to the principles that we are working for, but also we have to keep the system running, and we are trying. I agree also that there should be someone from the development side here. We are doing a lot of things where we would say this is in the long run, and we are trying to also address issues. We cannot neglect them of development, but it is very true that it would need a real development actor that is getting busy with that or to cooperate with. Right. Thank you very much.
I see we only have 2 minutes left, so Nabaz, would you mind to speak, but like not more than a minute or so?
Okay. Well, I also totally agree that there should be a development actor on this panel, so we can discuss more in details and how to develop this link between the humanitarian and the development. Also regarding the political influence of the funding for the development program, I think this affected not only in a specific region, it is the worldwide that we don't have the control on it, but we try to advocate, we try to push forward that this system needed to be changed. Thank you.
It will be a long half a minute. First of all, to agree with my colleague of the BMZ, of course, I'm trying hard to present our approach comprehensively, but I'm the humanitarian guy, so my knowledge on that side obviously is stronger, so it would have been good, I think. The question about the neo-colonial structures, there, honestly speaking, I do not agree. And the Grand Bargain and all the discussions around that are going really in the right direction. Localization is making progress, step by step. It takes time. We can go further. Concepts need to be developed, but it is happening. Participation of the persons affected is increasingly happening. Cash as an instrument which gives more flexibility and dignity to the persons affected is happening, is increasing. Support to the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is an excellent example of localization, and I think this is really where the needs are being assessed from the grassroots. Humanitarian disaster risk reduction is very much about building resilience of the population in order to help the population use their own capacities and not relying when disaster strikes on humanitarian assistance. Country-based pooled funds. We put this year 100 million euros into country-based pooled funds, and country-based pooled funds are very much supporting localization, and I think Nabaz could talk about that. The longer-term funding, it is happening. Actually, I think that almost 1/3 of the humanitarian funding that we will have next year has already been committed. We are doing 1 year, 2 year, 3 year humanitarian projects. However, it must make sense in operational terms. longer-term funding must be linked to longer-term planning cycles in protracted situations. And so we are calling for the large humanitarian organizations to also work on the project cycles. And by the way, having a longer project cycle on the humanitarian side in a protracted situation would very much help to promote the nexus, because then the planning cycles of the development and humanitarian people come together. And now my final word, if you allow, because I did not respond to what François and Florian and Ulrike said, and this was actually meant to be my message, but unfortunately probably I haven't brought it across clearly enough. We must not fall into the trap. You said security, I said peace. Okay, we must not fall into the trap to instrumentalize humanitarian assistance by linking it to the stabilization people. But on the other hand, we must also not fall into the trap of instrumentalizing humanitarian assistance for development purposes, for the reasons you mentioned. But on the other side, we know that we need to talk to each other, we need to take into account what we are doing, we need, where necessary, adapt our projects on what we know about the others, because we will not get out of protracted situations if we don't do that. And when I was talking, Ulrike, about comprehensive approach to a crisis, then I meant just the humanitarians addressing the humanitarian needs is not enough. We must focus much more on preventing, reducing, ending, and then in that context, a comprehensive approach means that politics, diplomacy, stabilization, development cooperation must do their job so that the humanitarian need is such that it can be addressed by the humanitarian actors. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. We will end the debate here. I will very much like to thank the four speakers. I also like to thank the audience for your excellent suggestions. And I hope we can continue next year with perhaps more development actors. And by then, perhaps the ministry can announce that it is now financing 5-year programs in 80% of its projects. So people, we see each other, and I think beware that in 10 minutes the final program starts. So you don't have so much time.